The silence was never emptiness. It was weight. It was intention. It was the kind of quiet that gathers wisdom the way oceans gather depth, slowly, patiently, without needing permission to be loud. For years, people looked at her and assumed her role was simple: mother of a visionary, witness to a legend, shadow beside a towering name. But that assumption missed everything that mattered. Because before the world ever learned how to say her son's name, she had already learned how to survive without applause, how to stand without being seen, how to speak without using words. And now, when the silence finally breaks, it is not to glorify Elon, not to defend him, not to explain him. It is to speak to you. She does not raise her voice. She does not posture. She does not seek the stage. Her power has never come from volume. It comes from truth that has been lived, carried, and paid for in private. When she speaks now, it is not a performance. It is a revelation. And what she reveals has nothing to do with rockets or companies or fame. It has everything to do with endurance, identity, and the unseen cost of becoming who you are meant to be. She knows something most people never learn because most people never walk long enough in obscurity. She knows what it means to raise children when the future offers no guarantees. She knows what it feels like to be underestimated in rooms that pretend to be polite while quietly dismissing you. She knows the loneliness of holding belief when evidence is thin and support is thinner. She knows what it means to be strong not because you are praised, but because you have no other option. People often ask how greatness is formed, as if it arrives through talent alone. She knows better. Greatness is shaped in kitchens late at night, in unpaid bills, in moves made without certainty, in decisions no one applauds. It is shaped by watching a child struggle and choosing not to rescue them from discomfort. It is shaped by refusing to let bitterness take root when life is unfair. It is shaped by showing up again and again when no one is watching. When she finally speaks, she does not tell you to chase success. She warns you about confusing noise for meaning. She reminds you that the world is very good at rewarding spectacle and very bad at honoring substance. She tells you that attention is not the same as respect, and visibility is not the same as value. She speaks of a time when doing the right thing will cost you popularity, and choosing your integrity will feel like choosing isolation. She tells you that this moment, right now, is one of those times. Her message is calm, but it is not gentle. It carries the firmness of someone who has watched cycles repeat and refuses to pretend otherwise. She speaks of how quickly the world builds idols and how ruthlessly it tears them down. She speaks of how dangerous it is to let other people decide who you are based on fragments they see online. She speaks of how easy it is to forget your own worth when comparison becomes constant and validation becomes addictive. She does not ask you to admire her son. She asks you to examine yourself. She asks you who you are becoming in a world that profits from your distraction. She asks you what you are sacrificing for approval that will never satisfy you. She asks you whether you are building something that will last or merely performing for a moment that will pass. There is a gravity in her words because they are not theoretical. They are earned. She has lived through seasons where strength was misunderstood as coldness and perseverance was mistaken for pride. She has watched people reduce complex lives into simple narratives because complexity requires effort. She has seen how quickly society praises results while ignoring the years of failure that made those results possible. She speaks about resilience not as a slogan, but as a necessity. She tells you that resilience is not about pretending everything is fine. It is about continuing anyway. It is about learning to stand in criticism without letting it hollow you out. It is about knowing when to listen and when to remain unmoved. It is about choosing long-term character over short-term comfort. She reminds you that silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is preparation. Sometimes it is protection. Sometimes it is the refusal to engage in battles that do not deserve your energy. She tells you that not every accusation deserves a response and not every misunderstanding needs correction. She teaches that dignity often looks like restraint in a culture addicted to reaction. When she speaks of motherhood, it is not sentimental. It is honest. She does not romanticize sacrifice. She names it. She acknowledges the exhaustion, the fear, the doubt. She speaks of nights spent wondering whether she was doing enough, whether her choices would lead to regret, whether love alone would be sufficient. And yet she speaks also of trust, the quiet trust that consistency matters, that example teaches more than instruction, that children learn who they are by watching how you live. Her message turns toward you again, deliberately. She tells you that you do not need to be extraordinary to live a meaningful life. You need to be faithful to what is placed in your hands. You need to be willing to do ordinary things with uncommon integrity. You need to be brave enough to keep going when the outcome is unclear. She tells you that the world will try to rush you, but wisdom grows slowly. She tells you that patience is not passivity, it is strength under control. She warns you about cynicism. She says it sneaks in quietly, disguised as intelligence. It tells you that caring is foolish, that hope is naive, that effort is pointless. She has seen what cynicism does to people. It shrinks them. It convinces them to stop trying before they ever truly begin. She urges you to guard your hope fiercely. Not because life is easy, but because life is hard. She speaks of responsibility, not as burden, but as privilege. To be responsible is to acknowledge that your choices matter, that your actions ripple outward in ways you may never fully see. She reminds you that influence is not reserved for the famous. Every life influences someone. Every decision models something. Every word leaves a mark. Her voice carries the steadiness of someone who has learned not to panic when things fall apart. She tells you that disruption is not always destruction. Sometimes it is revelation. Sometimes it shows you what was never stable to begin with. Sometimes it forces you to rebuild on something stronger. She encourages you not to fear change, but to fear stagnation disguised as security. She speaks about dignity, how easily it is traded for convenience. She tells you that dignity is maintained through small, daily choices, how you speak when you are angry, how you treat those who cannot benefit you, how you behave when no one is watching. She says that dignity cannot be outsourced. It is cultivated internally and expressed consistently. There is compassion in her message, but it is not indulgent. She understands failure intimately. She does not shame it. She contextualizes it. Failure, she says, is a teacher, but only if you are willing to listen without letting it define you. She tells you that the difference between those who grow and those who remain stuck is not talent, but humility, the willingness to learn, adjust, and continue. She reminds you that comparison is a thief, not because it hurts your feelings, but because it distorts your vision. It makes you measure your life against someone else's highlight reel. It convinces you that you are behind when you may simply be on a different path. She urges you to respect the uniqueness of your timing. When she finally pauses, the silence returns, but it is different now. It is not empty. It is full. It is filled with questions that linger and truths that refuse to be ignored. She has not given you a blueprint. She has given you something more valuable, perspective. This was never about Elon. It was about what it takes to raise something meaningful in a world obsessed with speed. It was about what it means to live with substance when surface-level success is celebrated. It was about the quiet power of endurance, the strength of restraint, and the courage of staying true when deviation would be easier. Her message does not end with inspiration. It ends with responsibility. Now that you have heard it, you cannot pretend you did not know. You cannot say no one warned you about the cost of shortcuts or the emptiness of applause. You cannot say you were never told that character outlasts reputation and that integrity survives every storm. She returns to silence not because she has nothing more to say, but because she has said what mattered. The rest is up to you. The silence she returns to is deliberate, but the echo of her words keeps moving, finding places in you that were already tired of pretending. She knows that real messages do not demand attention, they wait for readiness. And if you are listening now, it is because something in you recognizes the weight of what was said. Not admiration, not curiosity, recognition. She understands that most people spend their lives reacting instead of choosing. Reacting to trends, to outrage, to fear, to the pressure of keeping up. She has watched entire generations confuse urgency with importance. She warns you, gently but firmly, that not everything that feels urgent deserves your life's energy. Some things are loud only because they are empty. Some things are popular only because they are easy. The most important work is often quiet, repetitive, and unseen. she speaks about loneliness in a way few dare to. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being misunderstood. The loneliness of holding values that are inconvenient. The loneliness of refusing shortcuts when everyone around you is taking them. She tells you that this kind of loneliness is not a sign that you are wrong. Often, it is a sign that you are early, or simply unwilling to betray yourself. She knows how tempting it is to dilute who you are just to belong. She has seen people soften their convictions, dull their edges, and abandon their principles for acceptance. And she tells you plainly, belonging that costs you your integrity is not belonging at all. It is slow self-erasure. She urges you to choose alignment over approval, even when it costs you comfort. Her voice carries the memory of sacrifices that were never posted, never liked, never rewarded publicly. She talks about the danger of living for an audience, even an invisible one. She reminds you that when your sense of worth depends on external reaction, you surrender control over your inner life. She encourages you to build a private foundation so strong that public opinion cannot shake it. She speaks of discipline, not as punishment, but as devotion to your future self. Discipline is choosing what you want most over what you want now. It is showing up when motivation disappears. It is continuing when novelty fades. She tells you that talent may open doors, but discipline keeps them open. She warns you about resentment, how it disguises itself as righteousness, how it convinces you that your anger is justified while quietly poisoning your peace. She has seen resentment destroy potential more effectively than failure ever could. She urges you to release it, not to excuse wrongdoing, but to free yourself from carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. She speaks of courage in an unexpected way. Courage, she says, is not always bold action. Sometimes it is restraint. Sometimes it is staying when leaving would be easier. Sometimes it is leaving when staying feels safer. Courage is not loud, it is consistent. It is the willingness to do what aligns with truth, regardless of how it is perceived. She reminds you that growth often feels like loss. When you outgrow people, patterns, or versions of yourself, there is grief involved. She does not minimize that grief. She honors it. But she also warns you not to confuse nostalgia with destiny. What once protected you may now be limiting you. What once fit may now constrain you. She speaks about patience with a seriousness that feels almost radical in a world that demands instant results. She tells you that impatience can sabotage even the best intentions. That rushing often creates mistakes that take far longer to repair than waiting ever would have. She encourages you to trust the slow work of becoming. She tells you that wisdom is not accumulated by consuming endless information, but by integrating experience. By reflecting. By noticing patterns. By admitting when you are wrong. She reminds you that humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking accurately about yourself. She turns again to the idea of legacy, but not the kind that chases remembrance. She speaks of the legacy you leave in how people feel after encountering you, in whether you made things lighter or heavier, in whether you spoke truth with kindness or used truth as a weapon. She tells you that legacy is built in moments you will never see celebrated. Her words carry a warning about fear, how it dresses itself as practicality. Fear tells you to wait until conditions are perfect, until confidence arrives, until approval is guaranteed. She tells you that if you wait for fear to disappear, you will wait forever. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is movement despite it. She reminds you that life will not always make sense while you are living it. Clarity often comes later, in hindsight. She urges you not to demand full understanding before taking the next right step. Trust is sometimes choosing direction without certainty. She speaks of self-respect as something that must be defended daily. Through boundaries. Through honesty. Through refusing to tolerate what slowly diminishes you. She tells you that self-respect is not arrogance, it is stewardship of your own life. She knows that some will twist her words, simplify them, reduce them to slogans. She accepts that truth often survives misinterpretation. She is not trying to convince everyone. She is speaking to those who are ready to hear. As she fades back into silence, she leaves you with something heavier than inspiration and lighter than fear. Responsibility paired with hope. Awareness paired with choice. She does not tell you what to do next. She trusts you to decide. The silence settles again, but now it feels like an invitation rather than an ending. What she leaves behind is not closure, but clarity, the kind that gently removes excuses. She understands that words alone do not change lives. Decisions do. And so she lets her message rest inside you, trusting that if it is true, it will begin to work on you quietly, persistently, without force. She knows that after moments like this, people often return to habit. They feel something, nod inwardly, and then resume life exactly as it was. She is not offended by that. She has lived long enough to know that transformation is rare, not because people are incapable, but because change requires discomfort. And discomfort is something most people spend their lives avoiding. Still, she hopes, not desperately, but steadily, that you will pause long enough to ask yourself honest questions. Not dramatic ones. Simple ones. Are you living in a way that aligns with what you say matters? Are you becoming harder or wiser? Are you chasing noise, or are you building something that will still matter when the noise fades? She speaks, finally, about peace, not as ease, but as alignment. Peace, she says, is what you feel when your inner life and outer actions are no longer at war. It is not the absence of struggle, it is the absence of self-betrayal. She tells you that many people confuse peace with comfort and wonder why they feel restless even when life looks successful. Peace comes from integrity, not from applause. She acknowledges the exhaustion so many carry. The quiet fatigue of always striving, always proving, always comparing. She tells you that rest is not quitting. Rest is recalibration. It is remembering that your worth was never meant to be earned through constant output. She encourages you to step back long enough to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. She returns once more to truth, the kind that does not bend for convenience. She says truth spoken without humility becomes cruelty, and kindness without truth becomes deception. Holding both is difficult. That is why so few do it well. But she believes you are capable of that balance. If you are willing to slow down and listen more than you speak, she does not promise that choosing depth over display will make life easier. It may, in fact, make it harder. You may be misunderstood. You may be overlooked. You may feel out of step with the world around you. But she assures you that living out of alignment costs far more in the end. It costs peace. It costs respect for yourself. It costs the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you did not abandon who you were meant to be. She speaks about time, not as an enemy, but as a revealer. Time exposes motives. Time humbles arrogance. Time rewards consistency more than intensity. She tells you to stop racing it and start partnering with it. To plant seeds you may never see fully grown. To do good work without demanding immediate recognition. She leaves you with a final understanding: not every meaningful life is visible. Not every powerful person is known. Not every important contribution is applauded. And yet the world is shaped more by these unseen lives than by the ones constantly on display. History is quietly carried forward by people who simply refused to give up on what was right. This was never about a famous name or a public legacy. It was about the private choices that define who you are when no one is watching. It was about the courage to live deliberately in a culture that rewards distraction. It was about remembering that strength does not always announce itself. And wisdom rarely needs validation. She returns fully to silence now, not retreating, not hiding, but complete. She has said enough. The rest belongs to you. What you do with this message will determine whether it was merely heard or truly received, and somewhere in that quiet, if you listen closely, you may realize that the most important voice moving forward is not hers at all, but your own, finally clear, finally honest, finally awake.